You're back. Welcome to Season 2 of The People We Meet. My name is Ty Brunner, and I'll be your host. This is a show about ordinary people that have done extraordinary things. I'm glad you're here, and let's get on with it. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The People We Meet. Now, most of the time, it's conversations. Ordinary people who've done extraordinary things, telling their own stories in their own words. And that's a privilege, and it's not something I ever take lightly. But not every one of them is still here for us to find. Some of the most powerful stories belong to people who are no longer with us. People whose choices mattered, whose lives reached further than they ever knew. When I come across those stories, I don't feel like the owner of them. I feel like a caretaker. Because when you really sit with them, you realize just how much greatness has already passed quietly through the world. Voices of the past is where I go to listen closely, to places, to memory, to the traces people leave behind when their lives were never meant to be loud, just meaningful. We're surrounded by noise now, loud voices, endless opinions, a lot of volume without a lot of depth. This is an attempt to do the opposite, to slow down, to pay attention, and to share stories that still deserve space. This episode begins on Spokane's north side in the Hillyard neighborhood. It stretches across an ocean to a small English village that chose to remember. This is Voices of the Past, and this is where I choose to honor people who came before us. Now, Hillyard didn't start out as a bad part of town. It started out as a destination. And in the 1890s, when the Great Northern Railway decided to build its massive rail yard north of Spokane, it didn't just bring tracks and roadhouses with it. It brought jobs, thousands of them. Mechanics, machinists, carmen, laborers, families who followed steady work wherever it went. And this place was called Hill's Yard at the time, named for James J. Hill, the railroad magnate behind the Great Northern. And for a time, it boomed hard enough that it nearly became its own city. Hillyard had order to it. Small houses with tiny lawns, tree-lined streets, high-ceilinged apartment buildings, a thriving commercial strip along Market Street, lined with shops and theaters and bars and businesses that catered to working families who expected permanence and not charity. And by the early 1900s, Hillyard was prosperous, self-contained, and proud. When Spokane formally annexed it in 1924, it wasn't rescuing a failing neighborhood. It was absorbing a productive one. And this matters because a kid grew up there in the 1920s and 1930s before Hillyard became the Hillyard we know today. Now, the rail yard was still running, the Great Northern was still employing thousands, and the neighborhood hadn't collapsed. It had stabilized. The real decline would come later, after World War II, when diesel locomotives replaced steam, slashing maintenance jobs and hollowing out the economic engine that had built the neighborhood in the first place. And that's when disinvestment set in. That's when reputations hardened. And that's when the area picked up names like Dogtown. Locals still use that name to refer to the eastern edge of Hillyard, the blocks east of the railroad tracks. There's no official record of how it originated. Neighborhood lore points to overlapping explanations. One, that the area once had a reputation for loose dogs running around, which I can attest to. And two, that it had become shorthand for where railroad workers lived and walked home from the yards. Whatever its origin, the nickname lives on in local speech and reflects how people have long understood that section of the neighborhood. But that wasn't the Hillyard of his youth. His Spokane was still a working city, and Rogers High School drew from that reality. Now, Rogers sits on Wellesley Avenue, a couple of blocks from a fire station, and a few more before you hit the 2900 block. Now, there's an old saying. In Hillyard, nothing good happens after midnight and before breakfast, or on the 2900 block of East anything. It's close to the rail corridor that fed Hillyard and the neighborhoods around it. Rogers wasn't a finishing school. It was a place that turned out people expected to work for a living. People raised around whistles, schedules, and the understanding that showing up mattered. Rogers High School doesn't announce its ghosts. It never has. I came to know that school decades later, not as a student, but as a firefighter. And at first, I didn't see it clearly. You'd finally sit down to eat, and the tones would drop. Fire alarm activated. Rogers High School. You'd pull your boots back on, throw in your bunkers, jump in the rig, and roll out, knowing there was a decent chance you were headed for a pull station some bored kid yanked for a laugh. And as I was packing up to go inside, some kid would inevitably call out, "Hey, fireman, show me your axe." And I'd be like, "Listen, kid, I didn't put down my lunch, put on all this shit, get in the rig, drive over here, throw my pack, and come tromping in here just to show you my axe. I came over here to set your fire alarm because one of y'all thought it would be funny to pull the station again." In those moments, it was easy to flatten the place into a reputation, easy to see the school as a problem, and easy to see the kids as the reason. But I'll tell you what, that perspective doesn't survive long when you're responsible for protecting a neighborhood. We covered that district. Rogers sat squarely in our first due. Those halls, those classrooms, those kids, those were ours. So we flew the Rogers flag off the back of the rig on football days, and we put pirate stickers on the rig. Not because it was symbolic, but because it was true. That was our school, and those were our kids. Now, a school isn't defined by what side of town it's on. It's defined by what it turns out into the world. And over time, across generations, long after reputations change, Rogers turned out rail workers, firefighters, mechanics, one rather prolific boxing coach, soldiers, and pilots. One of them walked through those halls when Hillyard was still holding together, when Spokane itself was still figuring out what kind of city it was becoming, a rail town, a river town, a place shaped by work as much as by ambition. A class of 1939, and his name was Charles Chuck Gumm, Jr. And decades before Rogers had a reputation, good or bad, it produced a young man who would one day face a choice that had nothing to do with what side of town he came from and everything to do with who he was. He wasn't the captain of a football team or the king of the prom. He was just a young man moving through a system designed to produce adults who could be counted on. The kind of upbringing that doesn't feel dramatic at the time, but it shows its value later, when the stakes are no longer theoretical. Now, Europe was already unraveling while he was in school. Newspapers carried headlines, radios carried the tone, and even on the north side, far from any coast, young men understood that distance no longer meant insulation from a world war. After graduation, Gumm went on to Gonzaga University, continuing along a path that looked ordinary on paper. But ordinary paths have an intersecting with extraordinary moments when history accelerates. When the United States entered the war, it didn't feel like a surprise. It felt like the next responsibility handed down the line, like a train arriving whether you were ready or not. Chuck Gumm joined the Army Air Forces. And that decision didn't come from bravado. Aviation in that era wasn't glamorous. It was dangerous, technical, and unforgiving. Training accidents were common. Aircraft failed, and men died before they ever even saw combat. You volunteered knowing that. Somewhere between Spokane's rail line neighborhoods and flight training fields far from home, the habits formed early began to matter. The ones no one called heroic at the time. The instinct to stay with a problem. The refusal to pass responsibility off when you were still capable of acting. Pilot training strips away illusion pretty quickly. There's a popular idea that becoming a fighter pilot is about daring, that it selects for bravado, fearlessness, a hunger for risk, or doing the flyby even when the pattern is full. And in reality, the process is more surgical than romantic. It's designed to find out who can absorb pressure without drama, and who can follow procedure when adrenaline spikes, and who can make clean decisions when the margins collapse to almost nothing. Now, Chuck Gumm entered that pipeline like thousands of other young men in the 1940s. He arrived as a candidate, one of many, about to be tested by a system that had no interest in protecting anyone's self-image. The Army Air Force's training regimen is relentless. Ground school first, navigation, meteorology, engine theory, emergency procedures drilled in until they became involuntary. You learned how engines failed, how airframes broke, how men died when they guessed instead of following checklists. The instructors weren't cruel, but they were unsentimental. Aviation did not tolerate improvisation where discipline was required, and you didn't do it until you got it right. You did it until you couldn't get it wrong. And then came the flying. Primary trainers were forgiving, but only slightly. Every mistake was logged, every landing graded. Students washed out quietly and without ceremony. Some were reassigned, some went home, and others disappeared into footnotes no one read twice. Advanced training narrowed the field even further. Single-engine fighters demanded a particular temperament. These aircraft were fast, twitchy, and brutally honest. They rewarded precision and punished arrogance. You didn't muscle them. You worked with them. You learned to read vibrations, subtle changes in sound, and the feel of the aircraft through the stick and the rudder. Sensory cues that couldn't be written down but had to be lived into the body. And make no mistake, this is where shit got real. A lot of times when mistakes were made, it didn't mean you scrubbed the rest of the exercise and went back to base. It meant you were dead. By the time Gumm earned his wings, the war had accelerated. Losses were mounting, and the need for pilots was urgent. Training timelines compressed, and there was less room for easing into competence. You were expected to arrive ready or adapt quickly. Assignment to a fighter group wasn't a victory lap. It was a statement of expectation. Chuck Gumm went to the 354th Fighter Group, one of the earliest American units to operate the P-51 Mustang in combat. Now, at the time, the aircraft was still something of an experiment. Promising, yes, but not yet the legend it would become. Early Mustangs were fast and had excellent range, but they demanded respect. Engine management mattered, fuel planning mattered, maintenance mattered, and the aircraft didn't forgive sloppiness in the air or on the ground. For pilots transitioning into the Mustang, the learning curve was steep and unforgiving. The airplane was capable of extraordinary performance, but only if you stayed ahead of it mentally. Get behind the aircraft, and it was going to remind you who was in charge. Combat training layered additional pressure on top of all of it. Formation flying, gunnery, tactical maneuvers practiced until spacing and timing became muscle memory. Escort doctrine was still evolving in real time. And the job was not to chase glory. It was to stay with the bombers, to endure long hours in hostile airspace, and to resist the urge to break formation even when provoked. This wasn't the kind of flying that made headlines. It was monotonous, exhausting, and deadly in ways that didn't look heroic from the outside. Some men struggled with that reality. Others, men shaped by places where work was routine and responsibility wasn't negotiable, adapted. And Chuck Gumm did more than adapt. By the time the 354th Fighter Group reached England in 1943, he was fully integrated into a machine that demanded quiet competence. There were no speeches about destiny, and there was only preparation, repetition, and the understanding that every mission carried consequences beyond the cockpit. Somewhere in that transition, from student to operational pilot, the habits formed in Spokane's rail-shadowed neighborhoods found their use. Show up. Do the work. Stay with the task until it's done. And soon enough, the Mustang would prove itself. And so would Chuck. Chuck went from a student just trying to make it through pilot training to an aviator that strapped an aircraft to his body and leapt into the sky. Now, the P-51 Mustang did not arrive in Europe as a legend. It arrived as an answer to the problem the Allies were bleeding men over. American daylight bombing doctrine depended on escort fighters. But early in the war, those fighters simply could not go far enough. The P-38 Lightning had speed and firepower, but it was complex, maintenance-heavy, and unforgiving in the cold, damp skies over Europe. And the P-47 Thunderbolt was brutally tough, a flying anvil with wings, but it drank fuel. It could fight hard, but not for long. And at the edge of German airspace, it had to turn back. And when the fighters turned back, the bombers went on alone. And these weren't milk runs. A milk run was a short, routine sortie with manageable risk, the kind crews counted on to come home. Deep penetration missions without long-range escort were something else entirely. They were long, exposed flights where survival depended as much on luck as on skill. Before the Mustang, loss rates regularly reached 5 to 10% on major daylight bombing missions. In practical terms, that meant a crew could expect to be killed, wounded, or captured after 20 to 25 missions, and sometimes fewer. On the worst days, the numbers were even harsher. During raids like Schweinfurt and Regensburg in 1943, entire formations were shredded, with dozens of bombers lost in a single mission. Losses weren't surprising. They were expected. The United States persisted with daylight strategic bombing for a reason. Flying by day allowed crews to see their targets, aim more precisely, and, in theory, reduce civilian casualties by striking specific factories, rail yards, and infrastructure instead of entire cities. Precision came at a terrible cost. Daylight made bombers visible, predictable, and vulnerable. The British, having endured catastrophic losses early in the war, had largely shifted to night bombing. Darkness offered protection from fighters, but it came with its own trade-offs. Targets were harder to identify. Bombing accuracy suffered. And civilian casualties were often higher, not by intent, but by consequences. Each approach reflected hard lessons learned under fire. British crews faced flak and navigation hazards that killed plenty of their own. American air crews accepted daylight losses in exchange for the chance, however imperfect, to aim more carefully. And courage wasn't the issue. Math was. And before long-range escort arrived, the math favored the defenders. Then the Mustang changed the math. Aerodynamically clean and designed for efficiency, the P-51 came into its own when paired with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Suddenly, there was a fighter that could fly high, fly fast, and most importantly, stay. They could escort bombers all the way to their targets and all the way home. But range alone didn't make the Mustang feared. What made it feared is what happened when it arrived. The P-51 carried 6 50 caliber Browning machine guns. Wing-mounted, harmonized to converge at combat range. At closing speeds that erased hesitation, those guns delivered devastating firepower. A short burst was often enough. The Mustang didn't need to linger. It struck hard, struck clean, and moved on. It was fast enough to chase, agile enough to fight, and lethal enough that German pilots learned to recognize it on sight. By 1944, the Mustang wasn't just another Allied fighter. It was a signal of a turning tide. And when P-51 showed up, the airspace was no longer safe, and plenty of German buttholes puckered when they saw that unmistakable and quickly recognized profile. The aircraft demanded respect from the men who flew it as well. It was powerful, responsive, and utterly honest. It would do exactly what you told it to, including killing you if you mishandled it. Pilots had to stay ahead of it mentally. There was no room for sloppiness and no forgiveness for ego. The 354th Fighter Group was among the first American units tasked with proving the Mustang in combat. When they arrived in England in 1943, they weren't stepping into a finished legend. They were stepping into a weapon system still earning its reputation sortie by sortie, pilot by pilot. Cold airfields, mud, weather that punished engines and nerves alike. Fuel calculations made to the margin. The Mustang was still being learned, still being tested, and still demanding discipline. And Chuck Gumm flew it the way it demanded to be flown. Precisely, attentively, and without bravado. He didn't try to dominate the aircraft. He worked with it, and listened to it, and stayed ahead of it. On December 16, 1943, that question mark disappeared. During a bomber escort mission, German fighters rose to challenge the formation. The engagement unfolded the way air combat always did, violently, chaotically, and at speeds that allowed no reflection. Seconds mattered. Alignment came and went in blinks. Chuck Gumm engaged and fired. And when it was over, one enemy aircraft was gone. Chalk one up for the good guys. The first confirmed aerial victory by a P-51 Mustang in combat belonged to Chuck Gumm. The significance wasn't symbolic. It was immediate and practical. It meant the Mustang worked. It meant the escort could hold. It meant fewer bomb crews would be left alone in the hostile skies. But there was no pause to celebrate. Gumm returned to the routine of war. Mission followed mission, escort after escort. And the Mustang continued to prove itself, and the air war began to tilt. Not overnight, but decisively. Bomber losses dropped. German pilots were forced into fights they couldn't always choose. And control of the sky began to shift. By early 1944, Gumm had become one of the most effective pilots in his group. His victories accumulated quietly. 6 confirmed aerial kills, and several others probable or damaged, enough to earn him the status of flying ace, the first Mustang pilot in his unit to reach that milestone. Other pilots noticed not because he talked about it, but because he didn't, because he stayed disciplined, because he resisted chasing glory that could endanger the formation. History would remember the first, his first aerial victory in a P-51, but it was the accumulation, the professionalism, the consistency, and the willingness to stay with the mission that defined him. And painted on the side of his aircraft was a name that mattered more than any statistics. My Toni, with an I. A tether to home, a reminder of what waited beyond the war. Now, wars are remembered in numbers. Sorties flown, aircraft lost, targets destroyed, victories claimed. History prefers columns and totals because they feel orderly. They make violence easier to manage from a distance. But for the men who flew those missions, war was personal long before it was statistical. And painted on the side of one of Chuck Gumm's P-51 Mustangs was a name that never appeared in after-action reports, and that was my Toni. Toni was his wife at home, waiting in a world far removed from the roar of the engines and the violence of the sky. And they had a young daughter as well, an entire life forming beyond the reach of combat, even as it shaped every decision he made. Naming an aircraft was common among fighter pilots, but the reasons varied. Some chose humor. Some chose bravado. Some chose names meant to flirt with luck. And Ozark could be crude, funny, defiant. It was a way to put personality onto a machine that asked everything of you. And Chuck chose home. My Toni wasn't just paint on aluminum. It was the name he carried with him. They represented the reason why discipline mattered, why recklessness wasn't an option, and why you stayed with the mission instead of chasing glory that might not come with a return. They reminded him that every sortie carried consequences beyond the cockpit, that success wasn't measured only in enemy aircraft destroyed, but in returning intact to his unit, to his responsibility, and to the life awaiting on the other side of the war. By early 1944, Chuck was flying constantly. The escort missions stacked one on top of another. Fatigue accumulated quietly. The danger never announced itself, but it was always present, in the weather, in the engines, and the long hours at altitude. Soon enough, that sense of responsibility would be tested in a way no mission briefing could prepare him for. Not in combat against an enemy aircraft, but in a moment where there would be no more formation to rely on, no radio calls to answer, and no margin left to calculate. Just a failing engine, the village below, and a decision that would define everything that came before it. March 1st, 1944, began like hundreds of other days had. Cold, gray, routine. There was no sense that this morning would be different from the ones before it. Aircraft were readied. Pilots moved through familiar motions. Inspections, checklists, quiet habits that came from repetition. War had a way of making even dangerous things feel ordinary. The P-51 Mustang lifted from the runway and began its climb. For a brief moment, everything behaved exactly as it should. Airspeed built, the ground fell away, and the aircraft settled into the early phase of flight, where attention narrowed to instruments, engine sound, and the subtle feedback every pilot learns to trust. And then the engine faltered. Not with smoke or fire, not with drama, just a change, a vibration where there shouldn't be one, a sound that didn't belong. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was failing, and it was doing so at the worst possible time. Low altitude, minimal margin, and no room to experiment. Engine failures close to the ground are unforgiving, and there's no altitude to trade for options. No long glide path back to think things through. You have seconds to decide, and every second closes doors. Below him lay Nayland, a small English village just waking up. And tight roads with closely spaced houses, a churchyard, and civilians who had already lived through years of war without ever consenting to be part of it. People had no warning and no control over what was going to come next. And the math sucked. He could bail out. The aircraft was still airborne. The parachute might open. The wind might carry him clear. And he might survive. That option existed. And it would not have been cowardice. No one would have blamed him for taking it. But an unmanned fighter doesn't just disappear. If he left the aircraft now, they would descend uncontrolled into rooftops and walls, into people who had nothing to do with the war he was fighting. And so he stayed. Witnesses on the ground would later describe the aircraft changing direction, not tumbling, not spiraling, but being guided. A deliberate turn away from the village. A pilot still very much at the controls, using what little time remained to shape where the aircraft would fall. Every second he stayed reduced his own chances. Altitude bled away, and trees rose up fast. The Mustang clipped a tree at the edge of the village. Metal tore, and the sequence ended violently and without spectacle. Chuck was thrown from the aircraft and killed. He was 23 years old, and when the wreckage stopped burning, Nayland was still standing. No homes were destroyed and no civilians were killed. A village spared by a decision made in seconds. There was no radio call preserved for the record, and no explanation left behind, and no opportunity to justify the choice or frame it in heroic terms. Then the war moved on. But the people on the ground understood what had happened. Not immediately, not all at once, but clearly enough. They had watched an aircraft that could have come down among them instead be steered away. They lived because someone stayed. The wars move fast. The front lines shift and units rotate. Names get folded into casualty lists and replaced by the next set of orders. What feels enormous in the moment can disappear quickly once the machinery rolls on. But villages don't move like that, and Nayland didn't forget. At first, there was only what people knew with certainty. A crash beyond the edge of town. Wreckage where there shouldn't have been any. The unsettling realization that the aircraft could have come down somewhere else. Somewhere worse, and didn't. People talked, not in speeches or the official language, but in the way small communities always do, piecing together what was seen from windows, and doorways, and fields, comparing angles, recalling the way that the aircraft changed direction, how it didn't fall straight in, how it seemed somehow intentional. And over time, the shape of the truth settled in. An American pilot had stayed with his aircraft long enough to steer it away from the village. He hadn't been obligated to, and there was no order that required it. There was no expectation that civilians should factor into a split-second decision made at low altitude. But they had. And he had. The people of Nayland understood something else, too. Something history books often skip over. They understand that this wasn't bravery in the abstract. It wasn't a gesture made for recognition or reward. It was a private decision made with no guarantee anyone would ever know. And as the war went on, and then finally ended, Nayland carried the memory forward, quietly and persistently, the way communities do when something feels unfinished unless it's acknowledged. Years later, a memorial bench was placed near St. James Church, not far from where the aircraft had come down. It wasn't grand, it wasn't meant to be. It was just a place to sit, with a name on it. A recognition that no one from Nayland had been hurt or killed on a Wednesday because a young ace fighter pilot with a wife and child on the other side of the pond had stayed at the controls. And at Christmas, villagers sent red poppies across the ocean to his widow in Spokane. Not once, but more than once. A small, deliberate act of remembrance. A way of saying, we know what he did, and we didn't forget. And back home, his burial place was far from Nayland, at Greenwood Memorial Terrace in Spokane. 2 resting places tied together by a decision made in seconds and remembered for decades. The war created countless moments like this. Choices made alone, without witnesses, without explanation. And most of them disappeared into the noise of history. And this one didn't, because the people who lived in Nayland understood that survival sometimes comes at the cost of someone else's life. And that debt doesn't expire just because the war does. Now, if you walk through Rogers High School today, nothing announces what happened in Nayland. There's no dramatic marker at the door, no more moment where the building pauses to tell you who once passed through. Students move between classes thinking about the same things students everywhere think about: lunch and friends and whatever waits for them after the last bell. And that's how it should be. Schools are living places. They aren't meant to be mausoleums. And yet, places remember even when they don't advertise it. When I think back on Rogers now, I don't think about the fire alarms or the interruptions or the irritation I felt in those early firefighter days. I think about the shift that happened without me noticing it at the time. And the moment when students of Rogers stopped being those kids and started being my kids. We didn't protect Rogers because it was perfect. We protected it because it mattered to us. Because those kids were going to be something, even if nobody could exactly say what that was. Some of them would leave town, some would stay, some would struggle, and some would surprise everyone. And that's always been true. What history does, unfairly, is compress outcomes back into origin. It makes it tempting to look at a person's beginnings and say, oh, of course he turned out that way. Of course this place produced that kind of person. But that's not how it works. Rogers didn't know what it was turning out in 1939. It didn't know that one of its students would fly a Mustang over Europe. It didn't know that a split-second decision over an English village would one day be tied back to its classrooms and corridors. All it did was what schools are supposed to do when they're doing their job quietly and without fanfare. It teaches kids to show up and to follow through and to take responsibility when it lands in front of them. Those lessons don't come with guarantees. They don't announce themselves when they take hold. And they don't always pay off in ways that feel fair. But they matter. And for all my little Rogers pirates out there, you guys matter. Where you come from matters. And what you choose to do with it matters. When we flew the Rogers flag at the station or rolled out with the pirate stickers on the rig, we weren't making a statement about rankings or reputation. We were saying something simpler. Those kids belong to the city, and the city belongs to them. And that's the part that lasts. Buildings age, neighborhoods change, reputations rise and fall. But the work of turning kids into adults, capable, accountable, willing to stay when it would be easier to leave. And it carries forward whether anyone notices or not. Rogers doesn't announce its ghosts. But if you pay attention, you realize it doesn't need to. It's got kick-ass kids in the here and now, walking out those doors every single year. History has a volume problem. The loudest moments survive. The biggest battles, the speeches, the dates everyone memorizes because they're easy to point to. What gets lost are the quiet decisions. The ones made without witnesses, without documentation, without any expectation of being remembered. Those decisions still shape the world. The past isn't gone. It's layered. It lives in places we pass every day without thinking about them. Schools, neighborhoods, streets, villages that kept breathing because someone chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. And that's what Voices of the Past is about. It's not about nostalgia or hero worship or rewriting history to make ourselves feel better. It's about listening for the moments that didn't ask to be recorded. Charles Chuck Gumm Jr. didn't know his name would be spoken decades later by people who never met him. He didn't know a bench would bear his name across an ocean. He just knew it was in front of him. His choice didn't make him famous. It didn't even make the history books. But it made a difference. And sometimes, that's the only measure that matters. This is Voices of the Past. Thanks for listening. Well, that'll about do it for this episode of The People We Meet. But before we wrap up, I want to give a huge shout out to my main man J-Mac over at Studio 42 Recordings. I couldn't do this without you, brother. And much love to my family for their constant support. And most of all, thank you, the listeners. This show exists because you keep showing up, and I don't take that lightly. And if you like what you hear, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook. Give the show a follow and spread the word. And if you know someone with a story that just has to be told, or if that someone is you, drop me a line at thepeoplewemeetpodcast.com. Thank you for listening, and be good to each other.